From the first paragraph of the Gallery of Beauties, the reader is immersed in 17th century Venice, transported by the sights, the sounds, and also the caution of the main character. This week, we chat with author Nina Wachsman about her Venice Beauties mystery series. Welcome to Blackbird Writers Presents Author Interviews. I'm Sharon Lynn, and welcome to you, Nina.
Great. Nice to be here and great to be your guest. Um,
We've known each other for so long, and I can't believe I haven't had you on the show yet. Because this series is just amazing, and the writing is just, like I said, so immersive. Um, like you read the first two paragraphs, and I'm all tensed up because I'm scared for this character, and it's 1612, yet it feels so immediate. So just thank you for being here and allowing me to read the book.
well, it's interesting because I wrote these books based on after reading the autobiography of a 17th century rabbi from the ghetto of Venice who is considered a Renaissance man because that was high Renaissance right after the Renaissance. And the thing that intrigued me about him was he was a rabbi, he was one of the chief rabbis of Venice. He was a scholar, he was an orator, he was a poet, he was a playwright, and he was a compulsive gambler, which works well in Venice because it was one of the places where, and he had the special privilege of being able to go out. Jews had to wear distinctive hats or a badge to mark them out. And he, because he was so famous because of his writing and his speaking, he was allowed to go out without the yellow hat or the yellow badge. So he could go to the gambling tables, incognito. And he was constantly gambling away all his money. So reading his autobiography, you'd see he'd be right. The thing that got to me is that some things never change. Once you're always people who play lotto are the same the guys then who are wishing that this time he'd win at the gaming tables. And then the other thing that impressed him, he had four children, was all he most of his book was about how he worried about his children. And that's again something that all of us can relate to. It's kind of a, eternal worry.
Yeah, universal.
Yeah. No matter what era, no matter what age, everybody's worried about their kids. Are they going to make a good marriage? Are they going to make a good living? The same things just are eternal. And that's what got to me also and triggered me, to realize that even though I'm writing about a different era, it's the same human emotions in
Yeah.
every era.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's actually one of the reasons that I love Shakespeare so much. Same thing. It's like, okay, the language is really different, but yeah, people are still doing that and that and
Yeah,
that, and stupid people do smart things, and smart people do stupid things, and
right.
like
Exactly.
the compulsive gambling. Yeah, when Diana, the rabbi's daughter, is thinking about um how they're going to get by and everything, and it's like, and he probably gabbled his wages, and was like, no, it's just like shocked.
Right. And it was
It's like
true. I mean, he
he
would
should
gamble
know
away the
better.
rent. Yeah. And he was almost on the risk of being excommunicated for his gambling too. So if he was that's his living. So he wouldn't even be able, what would happen to him? So there was a lot at stake and he couldn't control himself. He really couldn't. So the only thing she could do was hide the money from her, which is anybody who has a gambler in the family knows to do the same thing, or any addiction. If they're
Yeah.
hiding alcohol, you're hiding cigarettes, whatever it is, that's unfortunately what you have to do.
And and we've been having to do it for, you know, hundreds of years.
Right, and that's what's so interesting. He wrote his memoirs in the early 1600s. I think the 1620 was the one when he wrote it. So he was in his late 40s or 50s at the time. But that's what's incredible that it survived, and you could read this diary from this person and read exactly how he's worrying about how he's going to pay the rent and what is going to happen to his children, and and that's what I love that
One
stuff.
last score.
Yeah, yeah.
That's not going to
So,
do it.
and like you, you write about Bath, and I assume you've been to Bath, and I've been to Venice quite
Lived
a
there for a
lot.
while.
Oh, so that's how you know how, I
Yeah.
mean, like when I read your book, I really knew like she's in the that Roman bath thing, and I was there, and it was so there. I knew exactly where she was and what was going on there. And that's the same thing I try to do with Venice because I go there a lot. I think the first time I went there was 2001. And since then, I go there every 2 years because they have the International Art Fair, and I have an art background. So I always go to the Art Biennale because some of the biggest artists come out of the Art Biennale and they have just such weird, innovative stuff. It's just worth going. And the other cool thing about it is the art fair they don't just do it in the big, well, they have a park in all the way back in Venice, which is like a like a central park, but they have pavilions for each country. So each country gets to nominate their artists. So you can go to the US pavilion, you can go to the Russia pavilion, and they all have their artists there. But then there's so many countries that contribute, they don't have enough pavilions there because that was done in the 1800s. They built them. So they take palazzos all over Venice that are not open to the public, and they open them up to the public and they put the artwork in the palazzos, so you get to go into these palazzos you wouldn't normally get to go into. And that's kind of cool, seeing the juxtaposition of this very modern art against this beautiful old Venetian palazzo too. So
Well, yeah, and you have characters going into these and living in these, and it's like, oh, that would be so cool. And the contrast to the rabbi's daughter in the ghetto
right.
and all of that, it's just again, it's just that it's visceral. You feel it as you're reading. Um, and actually, and that was one of my questions. So it's a gallery of beauty. So we have an artist who is painting these beautiful, beautiful women. And you describe his painting technique as he sees somebody and he hears a tune and he has to paint them in order to create the music. And I've never heard that description before. And you just said you had a background in art. So tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's funny because that's exactly what I tapped into. I went to art school, I went to Parsons School of Design, and and so we had at that time, Larry Rivers was a teacher there, Elaine de Kooning was a teacher there. There were a lot of famous artists there. What's his name? Andy Warhol used to come to the school all the time.
Wow.
And so we really were immersed in what it's like to paint. And one of the things that I found when I was painting there is that it's a very visceral experience. It's not, and the more you think, the worse your art is going to be. So
Same with acting.
yeah. So you have to put stimulus there. So a lot of people, that's why a lot of artists have music playing in the background. But what I found is that there is, for me, sometimes when I paint, because I do still paint, sometimes when I paint, I do hear music that's based on the setting or the characters or what I'm painting. And that music is really kind of in my head and it helps me paint. So that's where that came from. And I thought it was a good way of looking at it because it's a lot like writing. If you see scenes in your head, right? You see scenes in your head, and what you're trying to do is get that scene from your head down on paper. So the same thing happens with art. You see something in your head, and the music is playing in your head that you're trying to bring it to life. And then if the music stops, it's like your inspiration stops. You don't know where to go from there. So
Yeah.
that's where that came from. And I just was going to say the Gallery of Beauties is a real thing. And I didn't know that when I started the book.
Oh,
The
that's
what
awesome.
triggered the idea was I went to Munich, and Nymphenburg Palace is in the middle of Munich, and it was the palace of Ludwig the First. And Ludwig the First was known as the big ladies' man. And what he did was he commissioned the Gallery of Beauties. And he told his court painter to go out and paint any beautiful woman in the streets of Munich. So they had people from all walks of life. His accountant's daughter, one was the toy maker was delivering toys to the palace for his grandkids, and he saw the girl who was delivering it and he thought she was beautiful and he had his painter paint them. So that kind of triggered it. And then once I found out about this Gallery of Beauties, I started doing research and I found this was a thing that all kings and noblemen would commission portraits of beautiful women to hang in their palaces, in their
I had
manors.
no idea.
I had no idea. So the reason I found out about it is I went to Hampton Court Palace on another trip, And then I'm reading, you go into all the rooms and there's one room that has paintings of all these beautiful women. And it was on the lower level, and they said it was the favorite room of William the First, William of Orange, remember, who came over, took over for James the Second.
Yeah.
So this was his room after his wife died. He was inconsolable after Mary died, and he had the paintings of all the court ladies put in this room. And this was like his man cave where he'd go to contemplate things, and he liked to look at these beautiful women when he did that. And then, so I had no idea. I didn't know it was written anyway. It was just on the sign in the room that this is described what the room was for. And then I went upstairs and there's another gallery, and that gallery is called the Windsor Beauties. And that was, it's in a long gallery, and it was King Charles II, the infamous King
Oh,
Charles II,
yeah.
and it's portraits of all his mistresses, including like, what's her name? The actress, his most famous one, Lady Barbara Villiers, is up there. So all of them, and they have a very different look than the women in the bottom. So then I
That
start to find
that
find
was
out that,
actually going to be my next question is so,
yeah.
how do these men's tastes compare? And is it really set
Well,
by the artist or the
no, it's
nobleman
set
or
by the king.
yeah.
So evidently, the upstairs gallery, which is the King Charles II, those paintings were originally in his dressing room. So they were just his, and it was commissioned by his some lady friend, and I guess she was currying favor, and they were all his mistresses. So it was a different purpose. And then like I said, the ones downstairs, William the First, they was commissioned as consolation, and they were court ladies. So usually they were always court ladies or mistresses of the king. But in the case of Ludwig the First, he really wanted, he felt women, he was known as a womanizer, but he believed women were very noble creatures. And that's what he was trying to show. He was trying to show that even the average woman on the street was this beautiful, noble creature. And so that's why he commissioned. And there were hundreds of them,
Oh
which
wow.
after the war, only about 36 are left. But what's interesting, if you ever heard of Lola Montez, I don't know if you've ever heard of her.
Uh-uh.
She was a famous courtesan. She was really an Irish woman who called herself Lola Montez and did kind of a sexy dance as a Spanish dancer. And he was besotted with her, so much so that he gave her the crown jewels. And she took to her heels and tried to escape Bavaria with them, but they caught her and brought her back and took the jewels from her. And then later on, she went to America and became a mistress of one of the Vanderbilts too. So her portrait is still there in that gallery.
Oh wow.
So that's what spurred me on because, I thought of this concept, the gallery beauties, and also Venice. Venice was a tourist spot, but one of the tourist attractions of Venice in those times was for its beautiful women, because they had this whole courtesan class. There was a book of courtesans, and so people who came on the grand tour, they didn't just come to look at the paintings, they came to see these women, because these were these notoriously beautiful, independent women. And so that's why they came. So I thought, isn't that the perfect place for an Englishman to go on his grand tour and commission the portrait, because everybody wants to take home a souvenir. So he would take home his souvenir of Venice would be portraits of the beautiful women for his portrait gallery. So that's where the idea kind of came from.
Oh, that's
So,
amazing.
yeah.
Um, we at the last conference we were talking at together, you were talking about the ghetto where all the Jews were in Venice, and I had never heard that before. And then uh, Eugene Levy, the Second City TV
Yeah.
comedian. He has a series about
Yeah.
he doesn't like to travel and he travels and he goes to places that
Yeah.
and
I saw that one of Venice.
yeah, and then there was one about him going into the ghettos when he was visiting Italy and he had no idea and I was like neither did I until I talked to Nina. So
Yeah. Well, the ghettos Jews weren't allowed, were second class citizens. Starting, I mean, I think it was always in Europe. So they always were required to live in designated areas. They weren't allowed to live with other people. So they were only allowed to live in certain areas. And every country, every city. The only exception was Amsterdam, where they were allowed to live with regular people, which at that same time. So if you see Rembrandt's paintings, he has a lot of Jewish themed things because he lived among the Jews in the Jewish area, just so happened to. And Venice was an international city. So although they built the ghetto to quote unquote within it, every in Venice is made up of different islands and they're all connected by bridges somewhat. In those days, there weren't as many bridges as there are today. There were more canals. So you really have to go to by boat to different, and that's why it's a church. There's usually a church on every city. There are tons of churches in Venice, and that's because every island had to have its own church. So when the Jews came to Venice and they wanted a place to live, so just like the Greeks, the Turks came to Venice, they had their area. The I know different nationalities had their different neighborhoods that they lived in. So the ghetto was kind of the Jewish neighborhood. The only difference was Jews were not allowed to, again, work in any, they weren't allowed to join guilds. They weren't allowed to work in many professions. So there were a lot of professions closed to them. So the only ones they could do was banking, which is why they came into banking, because they had rules at that time that you couldn't make loans if you were Christian and charge interest. So the only ones who could make loans were the Jews. So that's why, and there was a time when the nobles were trying to break away from the church and they needed money for armies. So they would borrow money from the Jews, and also they became a luxury goods trade. And Venice was this, silk came in from Venice, all spices, all that stuff was all coming thanks to Marco Polo. So the Jews kind of were in the right place at the right time because they engaged in trade because that they were allowed to do. And so the Jews came from all over. A lot of them came when they were kicked out of Spain in the 1400s, 1492. They came from Portugal, they came from Spain, and they went to Venice. And earlier, German Jews came earlier because they weren't allowed to live in a lot of places in Germany, so they came there also. So that's kind of the reason that they lived in ghettos. But ghettos were always, Jews were forced to live in ghettos. They were forced to wear badges from the 1200s. They were one of the popes made an edict that all Jews have to wear a yellow insignia, whether a hat, a veil, or a badge on their clothing. And in Venice, the rule was probably the most lax of most of the other places. Like in the Papal States, it was obviously much more
Right.
enforced. And then the only other rule they couldn't work, like I said, in many professions. The only other rule they had was that they weren't allowed to leave the ghetto at night. So they had to be locked in at night. And the biggest thing is that they didn't want intermarriage. That was the big reason why they did it. Didn't want Jews and non-Jews intermarrying. So they felt if you go out at night to all these places, that's where you can meet,
That's where the temptation is.
That's where it is. So that's why they didn't allow it. But non-Jews could come in and out of the ghetto as they chose. And when I was there, when you go to the ghetto, you see like there's a couple of passageways to get into where the ghetto island is. And I always read that they closed off the gates. So I always said, how did I don't understand what kind of gates. I wanted to know what it was. So I asked, they have a tour of the ghetto, and I asked one of the tour guides there, and he told me, and he found me a picture actually, that there was a drawbridge that went over the water. And so they used to pull up the drawbridge at night. So you would have to pay you could bribe, I guess, and get the drawbridge down. But if you were caught, and that's something you read about in the book, where she goes out at night and she's very afraid that if she gets caught, that she could be fined or thrown in prison,
Yeah.
my lead character. And also, she's also not wearing her badge. So she's also afraid if she gets caught without the badge, she'll also, get in trouble too.
Yeah, her fear is so palpable throughout, because it's
Yeah,
like again that opening couple of paragraphs, she pulls her shawl
yeah,
around the yellow badge, and it's like, oh, and you're scared for her right away. Yet she has this drive, and it takes her out, and it takes her sometimes beyond where she should be. Um,
yeah, exactly. She's very curious. She was intellectually curious and she wanted to know what was going on outside because she's in it. That's why we have that term ghettoized, because your scope is very narrow when you're only allowed to live, and especially for women, they're only allowed, they're not going out and do business with other people.
Right.
So her scope was very narrow, and she just wanted, and especially in art, I wanted her to be very curious about art
Yeah, I
because,
love how she keeps interrupting the artist. It's like,
yes. Yeah, he's getting annoyed, exactly. But that was something also I brought in from art school is how they painted in that time, which was they painted the canvas black first, and then they painted basically built up the layers from dark to light. So the top layer was when they added the white. And that's why you see the figures in old masters, they look like they're emerging from the shadows, like a Caravaggio
Mhm.
especially.
Yeah.
It's like that. So I wanted to get that across because that was something that she was trying to understand how the technique, how it got to be so realistic. How do you get that 3D effect? Because she had no way to know that from being in the ghetto.
Um, so kind of there's a big bad evil in the story, the Council of Ten. So can
Right.
you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that fascinated me. And basically they were the magistrates of Venice. So the thing that was unusual about Venice was it wasn't a monarchy. It was almost like a meritocracy because there was a senate of 100 senators,
Um,
and they were you didn't have to only be a nobleman, you could be the merchant class also. So it wasn't strictly based on blood, it was basically based on money. Venice was a culture that really lived for the dollar or for what ducats or whatever they had. It
yeah.
was a very mercantile industry. So if you had money, you were somebody and you could be in the Senate. Out of those 100, they picked 10 who became the magistrates. And their goal, their job was to really reinforce the laws of Venice. So they would be dealing with crime, they would be dealing with spies and all kind of stuff. And they employed assassins as well. They employed investigators, and they had their own not I wouldn't say a police force. It's almost like their own secret police, which I called the men with dark cloaks to give
Yeah.
them a
And they were
name.
terrifying.
Yeah. And then the interesting thing, somewhat like what you hear about in Russia, is they have, if you go to the Doge's palace, if you go to the side of the palace, you'll see there's like this mask with an open mouth. And it was called the Mouth of the Lion, the Boca de Leon. And any person, it was kind of where you could rat on somebody. So you can put a note into the Boca Leon and tell on somebody that they're doing something wrong. So that was like the tip line,
Oh,
that
wow.
was like their tip line. But, so it was bad because people could be ratted out there. But on the other hand, it was also used by people to get in touch with the government to let them know when they're unhappy about something. So, for example, they used to have, with the opening of Carnival, which is opening right now in Venice,
Yeah.
they used to have a running of the bulls that went across the Rialto Bridge. So people started putting notes in the Boca de Leon saying, you got to stop it because too many people are getting gored. So they did stop it. So it did have a good
I was going to say,
purpose.
that sounds so dangerous.
It was dangerous. So that was stopped because of that. So it was a good thing. So that's why I was saying that in a way, the Venetian government was very much a government of the people, and they weren't like this arbitrary, whimsical government. And that's why it was very much admired, and that's why they're very successful for a very long time. They didn't let the Pope influence. Also, the Inquisition never really got strong in Venice either, which is also, and the Inquisition in Spain at least became very corrupt and just went after people to get their money. I mean, people know they went after Jews in the 1490s, but by the 1700s, there really weren't any Jews left there. And they were going after what they named somebody as a new Christian, and really it was to get their property. So it was a very corrupt thing, and they even went to the New World and tried to go after fortunes in the New World. But in Venice, they really hated it because again, they were very conscious of money, and they didn't want the Pope taking a cut of what they were getting in Venice. So that was very interesting. And the thing I also asked one of the guy in the Jewish museum was, how come Venice is one of the few cities that really never had pogroms in it. They never really attacked the Jews. They never massacred Jews in Venice. At the worst, they would banish them from time to time. There was a couple of banishments. But I asked them, why didn't they do? Because almost every other city they would do that. In fact, it happened in Kona, which is outside, which is in the Veneto, and they said because the Jews were taxed, they had to pay three times the normal tax. So they would actually lose money if they killed a Jew because they're losing three times the money. So, like I said, that was their god was money. So they weren't going to
Yeah,
do
yeah.
anything that was going to affect them negatively in their pocketbook, which I thought was interesting.
Yeah, well, yeah, you needed the loans too, so.
Yeah. So the Council of Ten were also known that, like I said, they had assassins. Venice was also known as the capital of poison. And some of those assassins, concocted their own poisons. And it's even rumored, if you've ever seen the TV show Versailles, did you see Versailles? No, there's one season where, and I was just reading about it during Louis XIV's court, where everybody was being poisoned. And they actually tracked the poison to a woman from Venice who had taken it from Venice. And the poison that I have in my book is a real poison. And it was invented by a woman, Juliana Tofana. It was called Aqua Tofana. And she gave it to women. They said she killed, there were probably hundreds of men who were killed from it, and she was based out of Rome. But if you had no choice and you were married off or you were about to be married off to an old man, you could slip a little aqua tofana into their drink, or you could put it on your skin. So they were known to put it, they'd wear makeup and they'd put it on top of the makeup so it wouldn't affect them. But if their husbands or lovers kissed or caressed them, they would get it took time. It wasn't an instant killer, but it would take time and it would kill you over time,
Wow.
which I thought was a very interesting poison.
Yeah.
So they think that Charles II of England was actually poisoned by one of the poisons from Venice because that's where you went to get these very subtle poisons.
Yeah, and I love the whole how the Book of Poison kind of just weaves its way through the story and yeah, and the murders start happening. Because while this is a just amazing, wonderful historical novel, it is also a murder mystery. Uh,
Right.
so that's kind of the other part of it that makes it so powerful. Um, so you just mentioned Carnival was starting in Venice, so tell us a little bit about that.
So Carnival, the first time I came to Venice, it was during Carnival. And there's just like nothing like it. You walk around and people are dressed in full 17th century costumes, wearing masks. It's very eerie too, because they're
I
kind
was
of
like, that would
like,
be so creepy.
it is creepy a little bit because their faces are these frozen faces. It looks like something in a nightmare, but the costumes are magnificent. And it's so like everybody on the street. Families are dressed in, a lot of families have the costumes from their traditions. Some of them just dress in costume like it's like their Halloween. So it's amazing, and you feel really out of it if you're not wearing a mask. That's how prevalent it is. But the
Wow.
other good thing about Carnival was in those days, all through the centuries, it was a time where it erased class because
Okay.
everybody was wearing a mask. So even everybody could go mingle, everybody could go to San Marco, everybody could see these. It was like a time to see marvels. They had all kinds of fireworks, and the fireworks originally came from China. So that's something else that Polo brought in.
Mhm.
And they'd have these human pyramids with acrobats climbing on top of each other, and that would be on a boat too, so it would go across the water on the boat.
Wow.
So now when you go to Venice, there are a lot of customs they reinstated from those times, which I talk about. So my character who never leaves the ghetto, she gets the chance to go with her brother. They go to see all the amazing festivities that are going on in San Marco. And one of the key scenes there also is something they used to do and they just started doing again, where they had an acrobat who would go on a zip line from the top of the Campanile, which is that tall tower in San Marco, and he'd go on the zip line down to the balcony of the Doge's palace. And sometimes he wouldn't just slide; he would do like acrobatics down the zip line. And if the Doge thought it was great, he'd award him a gold medal for doing it. If he was bad, it was like not good. But they did that for many years. And then of course in the when the Austrians took over and Napoleon took over, they stopped it. But a couple of years ago they started again. So they do it again now. And I was just and it's amazing. So that's how they start Carnival. It's called now I think it's called it used to be called the Flight of the Turk. I don't know why. Now it's called the Flight of the Angel because they have somebody in an angel's costume who does that down there. So that was one of the key scenes because the courtesan, who's another main character in the book, she is so influential and so well thought of in Venice that she becomes one, she gets to go on the balcony where the Doge and all the notables of Venice are on that balcony, including the Spanish ambassador. Everybody is on that balcony. So the fact that she's gotten to that place where she's able to mingle
Mhm.
with the notables and somebody also asked me about courtesans because courtesans of Venice were more like geishas of
Mhm.
in Japan, where
Yeah.
they were not considered the elite courtesans, were called the cortejana honesta, the honest courtesans. So
Yeah.
they were considered, people, men had to marry not for love, obviously, but for alliances. So the
Mhm.
courtesans were more like their mistresses. So they were very well read, they were very accomplished, they were allowed to live on their own, which is a big deal. And that was the other thing that impressed me about Venice. Like I said, Venice was different than other European cities because it wasn't a monarchy, it was a more of a meritocracy. But the other thing that was different about it is that women had much more freedom and rights in Venice. And you could see behind me, there's a book. I don't know if you could see it. This book right there. You see that?
Yeah.
It's called A Beautiful Woman in Venice. And I found it when I was in Venice. And what it is about all these famous women, beauties in Venice, who did unusual things. One of them, and that's kind of I use for the portrait gallery of who they want to paint, who the artist paints in the portrait gallery. One of them, the most famous one, is Elena Corsanaro, I think her name was. She was a woman, she was a genius. She was about 16 years old. She spoke several languages. She played multiple instruments. She was a mathematical genius. And her family used to set her up to give like expositions of her brain power, and people would pay admission to hear her talk in different languages or give a speech about something. And she was the first woman ever to get a PhD from a university, and she got it from the University of Padua. And if you go to Vassar College, they have a whole wall dedicated to her. So that was pretty unusual for a woman to go to be accepted into a university because she
Yeah.
was such a brilliant person. A couple of artists were also there. The famous one is Rosaria Calabro, who was a pastel artist, pastel portraitist, who was known throughout, it was all in the courts of Europe. She was a little later in the 17th century. And then there were the other thing that was very interesting to me, and they're in characters in the book, is women glass blowers, glass
Yeah.
makers.
Yeah.
So as
And
everybody
again,
knows,
just part of that really visual scenes when
right, because the women and those things that I wrote about in the book are true. There were two women glassmakers who were very famous um, because one of the things was so they lived on the island of Murano. The interesting thing was they had brothers who could have inherited the factories from their father, but the father designated both of them to run the factory. So
wow.
they ran their businesses, and each of them invented some different kind of glass. So one of them is in the book, which is a woman invented this way to do a ship, like an actual sailing ship made out of glass. And it was a big thing, a big collector's item to get these glass ships. So that was one of them. And the other thing that's still around today, if you go to Venice, they have these little beads that looks like flowers in them.
Mhm.
So that was also invented by another woman. So there were two women glass makers that were famous in Venice, and I kind of combined them as that's one of the women whose portrait Marietta, I think her name
Yeah.
was painted for the Gallery of Beauties. But I thought that was really interesting that women were allowed a lot of freedom there. So aside from being a courtesan, you didn't have to just be a courtesan to have freedom. You could run a business, you could be a brilliant person, you could be an orator, you could be a singer. There were, in my latest book, which is The Courtesan's Pirate, it's about the Duke of Mantua coming to Venice because he was considering moving there. And he brought along his favorite singer, who was kind of like the Maria Callas of that time, and and she was also independent. So I like the fact, to me, that's hard when you're writing historicals to write about women who women today could relate to.
Yeah.
So I was able to write women characters who were strong women characters who we could relate to because they actually were women like that at the time. Women were had more freedom than they did like in England at the same time.
Well, yeah, well, even like 1900s, I had a hard time
Mhm.
getting into Downton Abbey because I was like, why are the hereditary laws so stupid?
Really,
Um,
yeah.
and it
Yeah,
was
they
just
were
making me mad. I
terrible.
wasn't charmed. Like,
Yeah, if you read Antonia Fraser had, who's a historian, she has this book called The Weaker Vessel, which is about women during in England. And in the same time period as I'm talking about, the 1600 early 1600s, women in England had zero rights. Their fathers or their husbands had complete control of their fortunes. They could throw them out of their house, take all their money, and they left with nothing. It was
essentially
awful.
cattle. They were
Yeah,
treated like cattle. They were
yeah,
traded and bartered, and yeah,
yeah. It's horrible. So that's another thing that attracted me to Venice is these, fabulous women who were so different at the time than other European women.
yeah,
And that's I needed strong female characters. So besides the rabbi's daughter, and that's the other thing, the rabbi's daughter in real life, he did have a daughter, and she was the only one of his children who survived him, who survives. He did have two sons, one of whom was really a pirate. So that was true. He sailed off and he never came back. The second son, the younger son who's in the book, who's kind of a troublemaker. He was a troublemaker in real life and he came to a bad end from it. The only one I didn't put into the book was his oldest son was a alchemist and died as a result of his experiments. So I didn't put him in. But that was another kind of get rich quick scheme like gambling.
yeah.
So it makes sense that he was like that too.
All right, so you just mentioned your latest book. So what is next for Beauties and for Nina?
Well, so the Gallery Beauties is the first in the series. You don't have to read them in order, but it if you want to, you can. And it introduces the two characters, the rabbi's daughter and the courtesan, who has a secret. And that's the second book is the courtesan's secret. So you learn more about her backstory, and she comes from the New World. So that's her backstory. You get a little bit about that. And because she comes from the New World and she's in love with Diana's brother, the pirate. So the third book, they decide to sail off to the New World, and that's called The Courtesan's Pirate, with an attempt to somehow live together in the New World. And it doesn't work out for them because a hurricane happens. He gets blown off his ship and captured by the Spanish, and then she has to try to save him. So she first searches for him all over the Caribbean with all the pirates of the Caribbean, and then she goes back to Venice to try to marshal her fortune to help get him away from getting back to Spain. So now the current book I'm writing, which is the fourth in the series, it's called The Courtesan's Memoir. And that came out of when I was just there in Carnival. I went to this museum that's called the Textile Museum of Venice. It's in the Palazzo Mocenigo. And that what they had there is they had these books that were owned by the courtesans. So I didn't know, we always assume that perfume comes from France, but it didn't. There were early perfumes in Venice, and it was the courtesans who discovered these how to use scents because, people didn't bathe that often, so they all had to use scents. And they also had all these beauty techniques for their hair, their skin. So they had these books of beauty secrets, and they were priceless. Like people would kill to get those books. So I thought, that's good thing for a murder
That is a
mystery.
great thing for a murder mystery.
So that's going to be the next book that's coming out in 2027, end of 2027. So,
Awesome. All
but
right.
I
And so,
forgot to say one more thing is that the reason I got fixated on Venice is because my mother's family, my grandfather's family, and my grandmother, who I never met, both of their families were in Venice. And
oh,
one of them was a chief rabbi of Venice at the same time. as my characters. So that's what attracted me to
So
Venice.
yeah, you stretch all the way back. That's
Yeah.
awesome. Oh, that I love that. So where can our fans find you? What are your social media?
Yeah. I'm on Substack, I'm on Facebook, and I'm on Instagram. On Instagram, I'm under at the Gallery of Beauties because there's another Gallery of Beauties on there, which is the one that's in Munich, actually. And
I'll
on
allow
Facebook,
it.
so you can look under Gallery Beauties, the Gallery Beauties on Instagram. I'm under Nina Waxman or the Gallery of Beauties on Facebook. And I'm on Substack as Nina Waxman. And my website is Nina Waxman Author. And so you can see a little bit more about some of my other work, like I do short stories too. Most of them have an art theme. And then I'm also a member of a group of writers called the Curators of Crime. And we all write about art and art mysteries, how mysteries in art, antiquities, um, and antiques. So, and
All
that's called
right,
the Curators of Crime
curators
dot
of
com.
crime. Uh, Thank you so much
Thank
for
you.
being here today. This was just a fantastic conversation. And thank you all for watching Blackbird Writers Presents Author Interview.